Hey everyone, Sean here, and welcome to the 10th episode of my quarantine-induced web series,
Old T-Shirt Tuesday!
I've decided to use an X to represent the number 10 for this episode, like Apple did when it completely overhauled its operating system. Until now, on some level, I've put off talking about 1994. A lot happened that year. I was still living in Massachusetts, I was still active in local theater, although I was starting to work a bit in independent and student films. At the start of the year, I was still driving the first car I had ever owned, which was a Pontiac Sunbird GT Turbo. I think it was an 87 or an 88, maybe? And I had bought it used a few years earlier in the early 90s. It was a fun car to drive because of that turbo, but it had all kinds of issues, which is why they stopped making it a few years later. So when 1994 began, my friends Chris and Danielle, who I've mentioned in previous videos, had just moved to Pasadena, California, and they were only going to stay for 2 years and they were going to move back to New England. Unfortunately, not long after they arrived, on January 17th, 1994, the powerful 6.7 magnitude Northridge earthquake hit Southern California. Of course, as soon as I saw it on the news, I called them to make sure they were okay. Physically, they were fine, albeit they were shaken up quite a bit, both literally and figuratively. Now, jumping forward to May of that year is when things started shaking up for me. I decided it was finally time to get a new car, so I started looking through auto magazines, and one car jumped out at me above all others, and that was the 1994 Acura Integra GSR. I had to have it. Unfortunately, the car was a bit out of my price range, and I had a very limited credit history, so I decided to lease the car with my dad as the co-signer, and I traded in my Pontiac, which had become a bit of a money pit. I loved my new car. It was fun and zippy, at least once I learned how to drive it. I had chosen to buy the one with the manual transmission instead of the automatic because it was sportier, more fuel efficient. Very shortly after getting my new ride, and I mean like within a couple of weeks, a relationship I had been in for 2 years ended. I would call it a controversial relationship, but very few people knew about it while it was happening, so it really didn't generate all that much controversy. But man, did it hurt when she ended it. Well, right on the heels of this breakup, and I mean within a week or two, something else unexpected happened. A female friend of mine living in New York needed a break and wanted to get out of the city, and at this point, I really needed a break too. I had actually fallen in love with her, and she knew this because I had told her this like a few years earlier. But my feelings were not reciprocated. I kept trying, though, to no avail. So by 1994, I was pretty well programmed to hear no in my head, even when the non-verbal signals seemed to be telling me maybe, or even yes. Well, we decided on this occasion that we should go to Niagara Falls for the weekend. So in early June, I drove down to New York to pick her up, and then we shared the driving in my new car to Niagara Falls. We stopped for lunch on the New York side of the falls before crossing over into Canada. While we were eating, I told her about my recent breakup. Now, I hadn't told her about the relationship at all, so this was all a surprise to her. When we went to check into a hotel on the Canadian side, the woman behind the counter, assuming we were a couple, asked if we wanted a room with the king-size waveless waterbed. I kind of chuckled to myself like, oh yeah, right, and turned to my friend, who I was expecting to be shaking her head, but she had a smirk on her face, and she said, "It's up to you." So a little bit surprised, I turned back to the woman and I just said, yes. That night we had dinner at this revolving restaurant that looks down over the falls. We had wine. I had the best chicken cordon bleu I've ever had. It was a very romantic evening. Or was it? Despite all of the signals, I couldn't let myself believe that this meant anything. After dinner, we walked around the falls a little bit and we passed a lot of couples who were making out. And then, of course, we made our way back to our hotel room, and she wanted to order a bottle of wine from the hotel. Mind you, this was like a Comfort Inn or something, so they weren't exactly going to have Chateau Latour, but it didn't matter. I remember she put the Knicks game on the TV. It was the playoffs. Then our bottle of wine arrived, and then we sat on the bed talking about who knows what, and enjoyed drinking our wine. At that point in my life, I hadn't really done much drinking. A beer here, a glass of wine there. We kept drinking. At some point, we were sitting very close to each other in the middle of the bed, and she was caressing my arm. But what had led to this point, and what was being said, I had no idea. I was going in and out of consciousness at this point. All I could hear was that little voice inside my head telling me, no, don't believe it, don't trust it. I was too drunk to do anything anyway. I'll tell this story in more detail in a different format someday, but this is supposed to be about t-shirts. So I bought this t-shirt from the gift shop while we were there. It's held up well. I haven't worn it very much. The fake double t-shirt look went out of style. And even though the material itself is pretty soft, it's fairly thick and heavy, so it can get kind of hot sometimes. But it's still kind of a fun shirt. Well, flash forward into the summer of '94, and my sister Mary is trying to get this movie made. I'm supposed to play one of the leads. It's a Western, but we're going to shoot it up in the mountains in Maine. That's movie magic for you. Well, we all get up to Maine, and then at the last minute, some major issues come up amongst the production team, and the entire shoot gets called off. I never really knew exactly what happened. At this point, I was done with 1994, and it was only September. We only had one working payphone where we were. Remember, it's 1994. There are no cell phones. So I called my travel agent friend using my calling card. Remember those? And asked him to get me on a flight to Los Angeles ASAP so I could get the hell out of town and visit my friends Chris and Danielle. About 3 days later, I flew to Cali. Chris picked me up at LAX and we drove to their place in Pasadena. It was my first time in California, and I had no clue that I was going to end up moving here myself someday. I booked my rental car in Pasadena. Now I remember when I went to pick up the car, they only had 2 cars left, a compact car and a minivan. There was only one other customer there. She was an older lady, and she whined that she couldn't drive a minivan, so I let her take the compact car, and I drove off with the minivan. Of course, Chris and Danielle still had to go to their jobs, so I drove out to Joshua Tree National Park for the day. I'm in this nice air-conditioned car, and right before I drive into the park, right near the entrance, I pull up to a convenience store to get a snack and some water. And when I opened the car door, oh my God, it was like I had stepped into a blow dryer. I really loved the park and taking the pictures, but I couldn't get over the heat. I mean, how could people live in this? On the way back to Pasadena, the weather report on the radio said that it had been like, 113 degrees or something like that in Palm Springs that day, which is right near Joshua Tree where I was. So I knew at that moment that I was never going to live in Palm Springs. While I was visiting, I also drove to Yosemite National Park and back in the same day, which is where I bought this t-shirt. Chris took me to Universal Studios, where I pretended to get eaten by Jaws. We all drove to Huntington Beach one day with friends of theirs, and I got to see girls wearing thongs for the first time. I hadn't seen anything like that at Hampton Beach in New Hampshire. One day Chris took the day off and we just hung out by the pool at their building. And of course we also walked over to Old Town Pasadena for food and drinks a couple of times. Chris introduced me to hard cider on Colorado Boulevard in Pasadena, and I've loved it ever since. It was a fun trip to go on after a year that had mostly sucked. Well, that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.